April 22nd, 1915. Ypres Salient, Belgium. A German officer sat in his command post late that night. His hands still shook as he wrote in his journal. The words came out fast and messy. Wir haben heute nicht gegen gewöhnliche Soldaten gekämpft. Das waren Teufel in Khaki. In English, this means, we did not fight ordinary soldiers today. These were devils in khaki. This is the story of what happened when German forces first fought a new enemy at Ypres in April 1915. These German soldiers were not new to war. They had fought in brutal battles on both the Western Front and the Eastern Front. They had seen terrible things. They had survived when thousands of their friends had not. But on this day, they met an enemy that shocked them, an enemy they would come to fear more than any other force on the Western Front. That enemy was the Canadians. By the end of this story, you will understand exactly why that German officer wrote those words. You will understand why the name Canadier became a warning that German soldiers whispered to each other in their trenches for the rest of the war. The spring of 1915 was a dark time on the Western Front. The war had been going for 8 months. In that time, 650,000 men had been killed or wounded on both sides. That's more than the entire population of some cities, and for all that death, almost nothing had changed. The battle lines barely moved. Soldiers lived in muddy trenches that stretched from the English Channel all the way to Switzerland. They faced each other across a wasteland of barbed wire and shell holes called no man's land. The German High Command was desperate. They needed a big victory. They needed it fast. America might join the war soon. If that happened, Germany would face even more enemies. The generals looked at their maps and saw a weak spot. It was called the Ypres salient. A salient is a bulge in the battle lines. The Ypres salient stuck out 5 miles into German territory. It was like a thumb poking into their lines. German forces held 85% of Belgium. They wanted to push the Allies out of that last piece. If they could capture Ypres, they could reach the English Channel ports. That could change the entire war. On the left side of the Ypres salient stood the Canadian 1st Division. These were 18,000 men who had come from across the ocean. They had arrived in France just 2 months earlier, in February 1915. Most of them had never been in a real battle before, not as a Canadian unit fighting together. They were loggers and miners and farmers and factory workers. Many of them knew how to hunt. Many of them were tough from hard lives in a tough land. But they had zero combat experience as a fighting force. The British generals had put them in what they called a quiet sector. This was supposed to be a safe place for new troops to learn about trench life. The Canadians were positioned on the left flank of the Ypres salient. Things were usually calm there, or so everyone thought. The Germans looked at these Canadian soldiers and saw easy targets. German intelligence reports called them weekend soldiers. Some German officers laughed and said they were just farmers playing at war. After all, these were colonial troops, men from far away. The Germans had been professional soldiers for years. Many had served for 10 years or more. They thought this would be easy. But the Germans had a secret weapon. For months, their scientists had been working on something new, something that had never been used in war before. In the German trenches across from the French and Canadian positions, they had installed 5,730 metal cylinders. These cylinders held 168 tons of chlorine gas, poison gas. The plan was simple and terrible. When the wind was right, they would release the gas. It would float across no man's land like a deadly fog. It would flow into the Allied trenches. Men would choke and die. The trenches would be empty. Then German soldiers would walk across and take Ypres. The war would change forever. This plan broke the rules of war. The Hague Convention said you could not use poison gas. But the German commanders did not care. They were desperate. They had been waiting since April 15th for the perfect wind. Day after day, the wind blew the wrong way. But on April 22nd, the weather changed. That morning was beautiful. The temperature reached 60 degrees. The sun shone down on the trenches. A light breeze blew from the east, from the German lines toward the Allied lines. It was perfect. The Canadian soldiers had no idea what was coming. They wrote letters home. They cleaned their rifles. They talked about how the war was not so bad after all. Some German deserters had tried to warn the British about the gas, but the British High Command did not believe them. How could they? Poison gas seemed like something from a nightmare, not something real armies would use. At 5 o'clock that evening, everything changed. The Germans were about to unleash a weapon so horrible it would change warfare forever. And standing directly in its path were these young Canadian soldiers. These men who had never fought a real battle. These farmers and loggers that the Germans thought would run away at the first sign of danger. What happened in the next 72 hours would shock German commanders to their core. It would create a legend that would help define Canada as a nation. It would make German soldiers fear the sight of Canadian uniforms for the rest of the war. The Germans thought they knew what would happen when they released their poison gas. They were completely wrong. The Canadian soldiers at Ypres came from all across their vast country. When war broke out in August 1914, thousands of men rushed to join up. In the first month alone, 33,000 men volunteered. The Canadian government built a massive training camp called Valcartier in Quebec. They built it in just 3 weeks. It had to hold 32,000 men. By October 1914, these volunteers sailed across the Atlantic Ocean to England. They trained more on Salisbury Plain through the cold, wet winter. Then, in February 1915, they finally crossed the English Channel to France. These men were different from most European soldiers. They were not professional army men. They were loggers who cut down giant trees in British Columbia. They were miners who dug deep into the earth in Ontario. They were farmers who worked the flat prairies of Saskatchewan and Manitoba. They were factory workers from Montreal and Toronto. The average age was 26 years old. Most of them were strong from hard physical work. Many knew how to shoot because they hunted for food back home. About 70% had been born in Britain and moved to Canada. But now they wore Canadian uniforms. They fought under the Canadian flag. They were commanded by a British general named Lieutenant General Edwin Alderson, but they were a Canadian force. Their rifles were called Ross rifles. These guns would cause problems in the mud and dirt of trench fighting, but they were excellent for shooting accurately at long distances. The Canadians had trained hard with these rifles. They could hit targets far away. This skill would matter very soon. Across no man's land, the German soldiers were very different. They belonged to the German Fourth Army under Duke Albrecht of Württemberg. These men were veterans. They had fought at Mons. They had survived the First Battle of Ypres. Some had fought on the Eastern Front against Russia. Many had been soldiers for 5 to 10 years, before the war even started. They knew how to fight. They knew how to survive. They had spent 8 months in successful defensive warfare. They were confident, maybe too confident. The German soldiers looked at the Canadians and saw jokes. Their officers told them these were colonial troops, weekend soldiers, farmers playing dress-up. German intelligence reports said the Canadians would be easy to beat. The Germans had no respect for soldiers who came from so far away. They thought real soldiers came from Europe. They thought professional armies would always beat volunteer forces. They were about to learn a hard lesson. Behind the German line, something secret was happening. German scientists had created a terrible new weapon. It was chlorine gas. This gas was a yellow-green color. It was heavier than air, so it would sink down into trenches. When men breathed it in, it burned their eyes, their noses, their throats, and their lungs. It made them choke and drown in their own fluids. It was a horrible way to die. German soldiers had installed 5,530 metal cylinders in their trenches. These cylinders faced the French and Canadian lines. Inside them sat 168 tons of chlorine gas. The plan was to wait for the right wind. Then they would open the valves. The gas would float across no man's land. It would kill thousands of Allied soldiers. Then German troops would walk across and take the empty trenches. This broke the rules of war. The Hague Convention specifically banned poison gas, but German high command was desperate for a victory. They did not care about the rules anymore. From April 15th to April 21st, the wind blew the wrong direction. Day after day, German soldiers waited next to those cylinders. Day after day, the attack was delayed. The men grew nervous. Some wondered if this gas weapon would even work. Others worried about what would happen if the wind changed while the gas was coming out. Could it blow back on them? Meanwhile, the Canadians spent a quiet week in their trenches. They did normal soldier things. They went on patrols at night. They fixed broken parts of their trenches. They got used to life at the front. Many wrote letters home. They told their families that war was not as bad as they had feared. This sector was peaceful. Nothing much happened here. Some men even said they were bored. A few German soldiers deserted and came over to the Allied side. They tried to warn the British commanders. They said the Germans were planning to use poison gas, but the British generals didn't believe them. Poison gas seemed impossible. It seemed like something from a scary story, not real war. They ignored the warnings. On the morning of April 22nd, 1915, the weather was perfect. The sun shone bright in a clear blue sky. The temperature climbed to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Men could feel spring in the air. And then the wind shifted. It began to blow gently from the east, from the German trenches toward the Allied trenches. It blew at just the right speed, not too fast, not too slow. The German commanders looked at their wind gauges and smiled. After 7 days of waiting, conditions were finally perfect. The Canadian soldiers had no idea what was about to happen. They had no gas masks. They had no training for chemical weapons. They did not even know such things existed. At 5 o'clock that evening, their quiet sector was about to become hell on earth. German artillery guns began to fire. But something was strange. The bombardment was lighter than usual. The explosion seemed almost gentle compared to normal artillery attacks. The Canadian and French soldiers in their trenches wondered what was happening. Why were the Germans shooting so few shells? It made no sense. Then, a few minutes later, soldiers in the French-Algerian colonial positions saw something they had never seen before. A greenish-yellow cloud appeared in the German trenches. At first, it looked like strange fog, but fog does not move like this. The cloud rose up about 15 to 20 feet high. It rolled forward slowly, steadily, like a living thing. It moved at about 4 to 6 miles per hour, just a slow walk. The cloud was huge. It stretched across 4 miles of the front line, and it was moving straight toward the Allied trenches. The French-Algerian troops stood right in its path. There were about 6,000 men in those trenches. They watched the yellow-green cloud come closer. Some men laughed nervously. Others felt fear in their stomachs. What was this thing? Then the cloud reached their trenches, and the screaming started. At 5:15 in the evening, the gas hit the French colonial troops. Men began choking immediately. They grabbed their throats. Their eyes burned like fire. Their noses and mouths felt like they were being torn apart from the inside. The gas was chlorine. It is heavier than air, so it sank down into the trenches where the men tried to hide. When they breathed it in, it destroyed their lungs. Their own bodies started making fluid to try to protect the burned tissue. But this fluid filled their lungs. The men were drowning on dry land, drowning in their own blood and fluids. Within 10 minutes, a 4-mile gap was torn in the Allied lines. In the first 15 minutes, 2,000 French colonial soldiers were dead or so badly hurt they could not fight. The ones who could still move ran. They fled in complete panic, coughing and choking and crying. They streamed past the Canadian positions, running away from the yellow cloud of death. Their faces were twisted in terror. Some were blind from the gas burning their eyes. Others vomited blood as they ran. At 5:30 in the evening, the Canadian soldiers realized they had a huge problem. The French troops to their left were gone. Their left flank was completely open, exposed, and the gas cloud was now drifting toward them. They could see it coming, smell it. It smelled like bleach mixed with pepper. The smell burned their noses even before the cloud arrived. The Canadians had no gas masks. No one did. Gas masks did not exist yet. They had no training for this. No one knew what to do. Most of them did not even know what gas was. Their commanders faced a terrible choice. They could retreat, pull back, save themselves. If they retreated, the Germans would break through. They would capture Ypres. The entire salient might collapse, or they could stand their ground. But that meant facing this yellow cloud of death with no protection. That meant certain casualties. Maybe it meant dying right there in those trenches. Behind the gas cloud came the German soldiers. 4 full divisions. That means 60,000 men. They wore primitive respirators made of wet cloth. They expected to find empty trenches full of dead bodies. They expected an easy walk to Ypres. They were confident. After all, nothing could survive that gas. The German commanders had promised them that. At 5:45 in the evening, a Canadian medical officer figured something out. He knew some chemistry. He realized the gas was chlorine, and he knew that water and alkaline solutions could help neutralize chlorine. He had an idea, a desperate, disgusting idea, but it might work. The order went out to the Canadian soldiers. Urinate on a handkerchief or cloth. Tie it over your face. The urine had ammonia in it. Ammonia is alkaline. It might help. It was crude. It was gross. But it was all they had, so the Canadian soldiers did it. They peed on cloth and tied it over their mouths and noses. Their eyes were streaming with tears from the gas. They were gagging and coughing. Their lungs burned. But they stayed in their positions. The Canadian 3rd Brigade on the left flank took the gas directly. The cloud rolled over them. Men choked and gasped for air through their urine-soaked masks. But they did not run. At 6 o'clock in the evening, the German infantry came out of the gas cloud. They were ready to occupy empty trenches, ready to step over corpses. Instead, they saw something impossible. The Canadians were still there, still in their positions, rifles pointed forward, ready to fight. The Germans could not believe their eyes. How were these men still alive? How were they not running? The Canadians opened fire. Many of them were hunters back home. They knew how to shoot. Their Ross rifles were accurate at long range. They started hitting Germans at 300 yards away. The German advance stopped. Confusion spread through their ranks. This was not supposed to happen. Now came the most dangerous moment. There was still a 4-mile gap in the Allied lines where the French troops had been. The Germans had 60,000 men. The Canadians had only 18,000. Night was falling. Visibility was getting worse. German commanders stood in their positions, confused. Why had the colonials not broken? Why were they still fighting? On the Canadian side, the 10th and 16th battalions held the exposed left flank. The gas was still in their trenches. Men were fighting while they could barely breathe. Every breath hurt. Casualties were piling up. But the line did not break, not yet. As darkness fell on April 22nd, the Canadian commanders made a bold decision. They would not just hold their ground, they would attack. This sounds crazy. Their men had been gassed. They were choking and half blind. They faced an enemy with much larger numbers. But the commanders knew something important. That 4-mile gap in the line was a disaster waiting to happen. If they did nothing, the Germans would pour through it. So 2 battalions got their orders. The 10th Battalion and the 16th Battalion, known as the Canadian Scottish. At 11:30 at night, they would attack. Their target was a place called Kitchener's Wood. This was a strategic position sitting right in the gap. The Germans held it with more than 2,000 soldiers who had dug in and set up machine guns. The Canadians had 800 men for the attack. They had no artillery support. There was no time to arrange it. They would attack in complete darkness with just their rifles and bayonets. Every man knew this was likely a one-way trip. The soldiers fixed their bayonets to their rifles. These were long blades, sharp and deadly for close fighting. They formed up in the dark trenches. Many were still coughing from the gas. Their eyes still burned. Some could barely see. But they climbed out of the trenches when the order came. They moved forward into the night. The darkness was so thick they could barely see the man next to them. They walked across open ground toward Kitchener's Wood. Their boots made soft sounds in the mud. They tried to stay quiet. Every man's heart pounded in his chest. They could hear their own breathing loud in their ears. The smell of gas still hung in the air, mixed with the smell of torn earth and gunpowder. Then, at about 50 yards from the German positions, machine guns opened fire. The night exploded with light and sound. Bullets cut through the Canadian ranks like an invisible scythe. Men fell screaming. Others fell without a sound. But the Canadians did not stop. They did not go to ground. They charged forward into the fire. The Canadian soldiers ran straight at the German positions. They were screaming now, not from fear, but to build their courage, to scare the enemy. The sound of hundreds of men charging and yelling in the darks was terrifying. The Germans kept firing their machine guns. The muzzle flashes lit up the night like lightning. More Canadians fell with every second, but the rest kept coming. They crashed into the German trenches. Now it was hand-to-hand fighting. Bayonets stabbed and slashed. Rifles were used as clubs when there was no time to reload. Men punched and kicked and fought with whatever they had. It was brutal and ugly and desperate. In the darkness, you could not always tell friend from enemy until you were right on top of them. The fighting went on for 4 hours. 4 hours of struggling and dying in the dark woods. Slowly, the Canadians pushed the Germans back. Their fury was unstoppable. These men who should have been dead from gas were fighting like wild animals. The German soldiers began to break. Some tried to surrender. Others ran into the darkness. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the Canadians held Kitchener's Wood. They had won, but the cost was horrible. Out of 800 men who attacked, 600 were dead or wounded. That is 75% casualties. 3 out of every 4 men were gone, but they had closed part of the gap. They had stopped the German advance. German commanders sat in their headquarters, reading reports from the front. They could not believe what they were reading. One report said, "The Canadians did not retreat, they advanced." Another said, "Die Kanadier, kämpfen wie Wahnsinnige." That means, the Canadians fight like madmen. The German soldiers on the front lines were spreading stories. They talked about Canadians who were wounded but refused to stop fighting. They talked about men with cloth tied over their faces, still shooting accurately even after breathing poison gas. This was not what colonial troops were supposed to do. Colonial troops were supposed to break and run. These Canadians were acting like elite shock troops. The Germans thought the battle was over. They were wrong. On April 23rd, they released more gas. This time, it was 96 tons of chlorine, and this time it was aimed directly at Canadian positions. The Canadian 8th Battalion, also called the 90th Winnipeg Rifles, took the gas cloud straight on. These men were already weakened from the day before. Many had damaged lungs from the first gas attack. Now they faced another cloud of yellow-green death. The gas rolled into their trenches. Men choked and gasped. Some collapsed and died right there. But the battalion held its position for 3 hours. 3 hours of breathing poison through wet cloth. 3 hours of fighting while their lungs burned and filled with fluid. They only pulled back when they ran out of ammunition. There were no more bullets to fire. Only then did they retreat. And even their retreat was organized. They fell back in formation, still ready to fight. They did not run in panic like so many other units had done. For 72 hours straight, the Canadians fought without rest. The line that should have needed 40,000 men to hold was being held by 18,000 Canadians, then 15,000, then 10,000 as casualties mounted. They had no reinforcements coming. British reserve troops were too far away. The Canadians would have to hold until April 25th when help could arrive. That meant 3 full days of continuous combat. German war diaries from those days tell the story. One officer wrote, "The Canadian resistance was extraordinarily stubborn." A German soldier wrote in his diary, "They came through gas that should have killed them. They fought like demons with cloth over their faces." These are not ordinary soldiers. Another account said, "We thought they would run like the French. They ran toward us." The German army was learning a hard lesson. These Canadians were not soft colonial troops. They were something else entirely, something dangerous, something to be feared. The German spring offensive at Ypres was supposed to be the blow that broke the Western Front wide open. Instead, it was a complete failure. The Ypres salient still stuck out into German lines like a thorn. The Germans had thrown thousands of men and their secret gas weapon at it. They had failed. This meant the Channel port stayed in Allied hands. It meant supplies could keep flowing from Britain to France. It meant the war would continue. The Germans were now locked into exactly what they feared most, a long war fighting on 2 fronts, against Russia in the east and France and Britain in the west. The failure at Ypres had another huge effect. British High Command realized that colonial troops could hold the most critical sectors. Before Ypres, generals thought colonial soldiers needed to be protected, kept in quiet areas, slowly introduced to real fighting. After Ypres, they wanted Canadians in the hard places, the places where the fighting was worst, because now they knew Canadians would not break. The gas attack changed warfare forever, but not in the way Germany hoped. Within weeks of the Ypres attack, Allied scientists were working day and night to create protection. By May 1915, just 1 month later, the first gas masks arrived at the front. They were simple at first, just cloth pads soaked in chemicals, but they worked better than urine-soaked rags. Over the next months and years, gas masks became more advanced. Soon, every soldier on both sides carried one. Chemical warfare became standard on the Western Front. Both sides developed new types of gas: chlorine, phosgene, mustard gas, each one more terrible than the last. The Germans had opened a door they could not close, but they never gained the advantage they wanted. Once both sides had gas and gas masks, it just made the war more horrible without changing who was winning. The Canadian reputation that was born at Ypres grew stronger with each battle. In June 1916, the Germans attacked again at a place called Mount Sorel, trying once more to push into the Ypres salient. The Canadians held. They took terrible casualties, but they held. Then they counterattacked and took back the ground they had lost. In September 1916, during the massive Battle of the Somme, Canadian forces broke through German lines at Courcelette. This was a place where British forces had been stopped cold. The Canadians went in and achieved what others could not. Then came April 1917 and the Battle of Vimy Ridge. This was a massive ridge that dominated the surrounding land. Whoever held it could see for miles. The French had tried to take it in 1915. They failed with terrible losses. The British tried in 1916. They also failed. Now it was Canada's turn. All 4 Canadian divisions attacked together for the first time. They had trained for months. They had built detailed models of the German positions. Every soldier knew exactly what he had to do. On April 9th, 1917, they attacked through snow and sleet. By April 12th, they held the entire ridge. What the French and British could not do in 2 years, the Canadians did in 4 days. The cost was high. 3,600 Canadians died, and 7,000 more were wounded. But Vimy Ridge would belong to Canada forever. In August 1918, during the final months of the war, came the Battle of Amiens. The Canadian Corps led the attack. They broke through German lines so completely that German General Erich Ludendorff called August 8th Der Schwarze Tag in German, the Black Day. It was the beginning of the end for Germany. The Canadian Corps just kept attacking day after day, breaking through positions that should have been unbreakable. From August to November 1918, Canadians advanced farther and faster than any other Allied force. The Germans changed how they thought about Canadian soldiers. German intelligence began tracking Canadian positions very carefully. When Canadians moved into a new sector, German commanders on the other side of no man's land immediately asked for more troops and more supplies. They knew hard fighting was coming. German soldiers developed what almost seemed like superstitions about Die Kanadier. Stories spread through German trenches, stories about Canadians fighting in ways that seemed impossible, about them being unstoppable once they started an attack. After the war, when German veterans wrote their memoirs, many said the same thing. They would rather face any other troops than Canadians. The numbers tell an amazing story. By 1918, the Canadian Corps had grown to 4 divisions, with about 100,000 combat troops. This was a small force compared to the British or French armies. But those 100,000 Canadians punched far above their weight. They suffered 60,000 killed and 172,000 wounded. This was the highest casualty percentage of any Dominion force in the war. They paid a terrible price, but they also achieved results that matched their losses. In the final 100 days of the war, from August to November 1918, Canadians captured more ground than any other Allied force. They took more than 50,000 German prisoners. That was 1/4 of all the prisoners taken by British forces in 1918. Back home in Canada, the government used the victory at Ypres for recruitment. Posters went up in cities and towns across the country. They told the story of the gas attack. They told how Canadians had held when others ran. Young men saw these posters and wanted to join. They wanted to be part of something that had proven itself. Enlistment numbers jumped after news of Ypres reached Canada. But more than recruitment, Ypres changed how Canadians saw themselves. Before the war, Canada was a British colony, a quiet country of farmers and resource workers. After Ypres, after Vimy, after Amiens, Canada was different. It had proven itself on the world stage. When the war ended and the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919, Canadian representatives signed it separately from Britain. Canada was becoming its own nation, no longer just a British colony. And it all started in those 3 days in April 1915, when untested colonial soldiers refused to break under poison gas. Behind the big numbers and the strategic victories were individual people. Each one had their own story. Each one faced death and made choices that determined whether they would see another sunrise. Some became heroes, some died forgotten. Some survived and carried their memories for the rest of their lives. Private Frederick Fisher was one of the heroes. He was part of the 13th Battalion, also called the Royal Highlanders of Canada. On April 23rd, when the second gas attack came, Fisher commanded a gun crew. They operated an 18-pounder artillery gun. This was a heavy weapon that could fire explosive shells at German positions. When the gas cloud rolled over their position, Fisher's entire crew was killed or disabled by the chlorine. But Fisher stayed at his gun. He kept loading shells and firing all by himself. He covered the Canadian withdrawal, giving other men time to pull back safely. He did this for hours while breathing poison gas. Finally, a German artillery shell hit his position. Frederick Fisher died there, alone at his gun. His body was never recovered. His name is carved on the Meenen Gate Memorial in Belgium, along with thousands of other Canadians who have no known grave. He was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor. He was 21 years old. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Burchell commanded the 4th Battalion during the gas attack. When the chlorine cloud hit his section, Burchell refused to leave his post. He kept directing his men, organizing the defense, even as the gas burned his lungs and eyes. The gas damaged his eyes so badly that he went temporarily blind, but he continued commanding by voice alone, calling out orders that his men followed. Burchell survived the battle, but his lungs were destroyed. The army sent him home to Canada, but he never recovered. He struggled to breathe for the rest of his short life. In 1917, less than 2 years after Ypres, he died from respiratory complications caused by the gas. He was one of thousands who survived the battle but died slowly from what the gas had done to their bodies. In his letters home, Burchell wrote, "We held because to retreat would shame Canada." He believed holding that line was worth his life. On the German side was a young officer named Otto Dix. He was a lieutenant in the German army at Ypres. Years later, he would become one of Germany's most famous war artists. His paintings showed the horror of war in brutal detail. During the battle, Dix made sketches of what he saw. He drew the Canadian positions after the fighting. He drew the dead lying in no man's land. After the war, some of his most powerful paintings came from his memories of Ypres. In his memoir, he wrote about the Canadians. They should have broken. Any rational soldier would have broken. They didn't. Even decades later, the memory stayed with him. The image of men fighting through gas that should have killed them. Corporal Leo Clark was 22 years old at Ypres. He survived the gas attack with the 2nd Battalion. He kept fighting through the entire battle and lived through it. In September 1916, during another battle, Clark single-handedly captured a German trench. He killed 18 enemy soldiers and took more prisoners. For this action, he won the Victoria Cross, but his luck ran out 1 month later. In October 1916, at age 23, Leo Clark was killed in action. He is buried at Perron Road Cemetery in France. His gravestone lists his age as 23 and his Victoria Cross. He survived the impossible at Ypres, only to die in a later battle. Dorothy McMurray was a nurse in a Canadian field hospital. She was there when the first gas casualties arrived. No medical textbook told her how to help these men. There were no procedures, no equipment designed for chemical injuries. She and the other nurses did what they could with what they had. In her diary, McMurray wrote about the soldiers she treated. She said, "They couldn't breathe, but they wouldn't complain. They asked about their battalions, whether the line held, not about themselves." She watched young men die slowly, drowning in their own fluids. She held their hands when there was nothing else she could do. McMurray continued nursing until the war ended in 1918. The British government awarded her the Royal Red Cross Medal for her service. But she never forgot those first days after Ypres, when the gas victims came in and no one knew how to save them. Many German soldiers at Ypres were young men barely out of their teens. One 19-year-old private wrote letters home after the battle. His letters survived the war, even though he did not. In his letters, he wrote, "We attacked through the gas and expected to find corpses. Instead, we found rifles pointing at us." In another letter, "They wore cloths soaked in piss over their faces and still shot straight." And finally, "The officers told us these were colonials, untested troops. They lied or they didn't know." This young soldier was killed at Verdun in 1916. His name was lost to history, but his letters survived in a German military archive. The survivors of Ypres carried their experiences for the rest of their lives. Many suffered from damaged lungs. They coughed and struggled to breathe until they died. They held annual reunions in Canada, gathering to remember their friends who did not come home. These reunions continued into the 1980s as the survivors grew old. The last Canadian veteran of Ypres was named John Babcock. He lived until 2010, dying at age 109. When reporters asked him about the war, he always said the same thing: "We held." Those two words summed up everything. They had held the line when it seemed impossible, and that made all the difference. In the town of Ypres, Belgium, stands a massive stone gate called the Menin Gate. It is covered with names carved into the stone, 54,896 names in total. These are the names of British and Commonwealth soldiers who died in the area around Ypres and have no known grave. Among them are 6,040 Canadian names. Men whose bodies were never found or never identified. Every evening at 8 o'clock, traffic through the gate stops. Belgian firefighters in dress uniforms march to the center of the gate. They raise their bugles and play a song called "The Last Post." This is a military tribute to fallen soldiers. They have done this every single evening since 1928, except during World War II, when the Germans occupied Belgium. Even on the day the Germans left and the Allies liberated Ypres, the ceremony happened that very night. For almost 100 years, the bugles have played for the dead who have no graves. A few miles from the Menin Gate stands another memorial. It is at a place called St. Julien, also known as Vancouver Corner. This is where the Canadian line was during the gas attack. A tall stone column rises 36 feet into the air. On top stands the statue of a Canadian soldier. His head is bowed. His hands rest on his rifle, which is turned upside down, the way soldiers hold their rifles at military funerals. The statue looks out toward Kitchener's Wood, where 600 Canadians fell in a single night. The memorial has words carved into its base. This column marks the battlefield where 18,000 Canadians on April 22 and 24, 1915, met the first German gas attacks. The statue is called the Brooding Soldier. Even in stone, you can see the weight of memory on his shoulders. The battle at Ypres changed how Canada saw itself. Before World War I, Canada was a British colony. A dominion, they called it, which meant it had some independence but was still under British control. Canadians were British subjects first, Canadians second. But after Ypres, after Vimy Ridge in 1917, after the other battles where Canadian soldiers proved themselves, something shifted. When the war ended in 1918 and the winners met in France to sign the Treaty of Versailles, Canada sent its own representatives. They signed the treaty separately from Britain. This was huge. It meant Canada was becoming its own nation, not just part of the British Empire. Many historians point to Vimy Ridge as the moment Canada truly became a nation. But Vimy would not have happened without Ypres. Ypres was where the Canadian military tradition was born. For many years after the war, April 22nd was observed across Canada as Ypres Day. Schools held special assemblies. Veterans wore their medals and told their stories. Young people learned what had happened in those April days of 1915. The observance continued until World War II, when new battles created new memories. But the importance of Ypres never faded from Canadian military culture. The idea that Canadians do not break, that they hold impossible positions and attack when others retreat, this idea became part of what it meant to be a Canadian soldier. Military academies around the world studied what the Canadians did at Ypres and in later battles. The Canadian Corps developed new tactics for attacking enemy trenches. They perfected the use of combined arms, which means using infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft all working together. By 1918, the Canadian Corps was considered the best offensive force on the Western Front. Other armies tried to copy what the Canadians did. When World War II came 20 years later, Canadian tactical innovations from the First World War influenced how armies fought. And once again, Germans learned to respect and fear Canadian soldiers. In World War II, German soldiers called Canadians Hitler's firemen because they always seemed to show up at the most critical moments in the hardest fighting. Something surprising happened in the decades after World War I. Former German soldiers began visiting the Canadian memorials in Belgium. They came to pay their respects to men they had fought against. German and Canadian veterans sometimes met at these memorials. They would shake hands, two old men who had once tried to kill each other. They shared a respect born from combat. The Germans respected how hard the Canadians had fought. The Canadians respected that the Germans had been brave soldiers too, even though they were enemies. Starting in the 1970s, some memorial ceremonies included both German and Canadian veterans standing together, old enemies becoming friends in the places where they had fought. The German military kept detailed records during the war. These records show how the German army thought about Canadian soldiers. After April 1915, reports started using special terms to describe Canadians. They called them Sturmtruppen, which means storm troops or shock troops. This was a term of respect. The Germans later used the same word for their own elite units. They called Canadians Teufel, which means devils. They called them unstoppable. A German tactical manual from 1916 included specific instructions. When Canadians are identified in opposing trenches, assume offensive action is coming soon. Reinforce that sector immediately. This was official German military doctrine. They tracked where Canadian units were and prepared for the worst when Canadians moved into a new area. What does the story of Ypres teach us? It teaches us that training and equipment matter in war, but the will to fight matters more. It teaches us that troops from colonies, men who were looked down on by professional soldiers, could prove to be equal or even better fighters. It teaches us that new weapons like poison gas can backfire. The Germans thought gas would win them the war. Instead, it just made the war more horrible for everyone without giving Germany any lasting advantage. And maybe most importantly, it teaches us that the true measure of soldiers is not whether they retreat when things get bad. The true measure is whether they can be made to retreat at all. After the war, German General Erich Ludendorff wrote in his memoirs, I would never have believed that colonials, farmers, and loggers could fight like that. After Ypres, whenever Canadians entered the line, we knew hard fighting was ahead. They were the best troops the British had. There is a photograph from April 1915. It shows Canadian soldiers standing in a captured German trench just days after the gas attack. Their uniforms are stained yellow-green from the chlorine. Their faces show exhaustion. You can see the burns around their eyes and mouths, but they are smiling. Behind them, the ground still shows the greenish-yellow stain where 168 tons of chlorine had flowed across the earth. Despite everything, they held. The Germans never forgot it. In April 1915, German soldiers asked themselves a question: who are these Canadians? By the war's end, they had their answer. The Canadians were soldiers who could not be broken, who would not retreat, who fought hardest when things looked worst. The Germans learned what it meant to face Canadians, and Canada learned what it meant to be Canadian. Not British subjects, but Canadians. A nation forged in poison gas and impossible stands. A nation that held when the world said it was impossible to hold.